Little Women, Chapter 1. "I don't think Christmas is worth anything without presents," said Joe crossly. Meg nodded, looking at her old dress. "It's terrible to be poor." "It's unfair that some girls have nice things and some don't," Amy said. "We still have our mom and dad and each other," said Beth gently. The 4 young girls around the fire were cheered at the thought of this. But then Joe said sadly, "Our father is at war, and he won't be with us for a long time." Then she continued, "Maybe he will never—" But she did not finish her sentence. However, each of the girls silently considered this possibility and remembered how much they missed their father. Then Meg said, "My mom says we shouldn't spend money on gifts when our country is at war. We cannot expect a gift from our mother or from each other." Joe said, "Each of us has only $1, and it doesn't do much for the military. Let's each get ourselves what we want and have some fun. We are working hard to earn it." "I teach those awful kids every day," Meg said. "What about me?" said Joe. "I work all day with an old woman who gives me different orders every 5 seconds. "I think washing glasses and plates and keeping things tidy is the most boring job in the world," Beth said. "My hands are getting too tired to play the piano." "Since my father isn't rich, I have to go to school with girls who laugh at my clothes and say mean things," Amy said. "I wish we could still have the wealth my father lost when we were little," said Meg. "I wish I was a boy," Joe said. "Then I could go and fight alongside my father." Meg was 16 and very beautiful. She had big eyes, soft brown hair, and white hands. 15-year-old Joe was tall and thin. She had long, dark red hair. Beth was 13 and a shy girl who seemed to live in a happy world of her own. Amy was the youngest, but she thought she was the most important. She had blue eyes and blonde hair that fell over her shoulders. At 6 o'clock, Beth put a pair of slippers by the fire to keep them warm, and Meg lit the lamp. Forgetting how tired she was, Joe got up from her seat and brought the slippers closer to the fire. "These are worn," she said. "Our mother needs a new pair of slippers." "I'll buy her slippers with my $1, said Beth. "No, I'll buy it," cried Amy. "I am the oldest," Meg tried to suppress them. "My father is away, and now I am the head of the family. I will buy," Joe said. "Then let's not buy ourselves anything this year, and we'll all buy her a present," Beth said. "This is such a good idea," said Joe. "So, what do we buy?" Everyone thought for a moment, then Meg said, "I am going to gift her a nice pair of gloves." "And I'll buy the best slippers," said Joe. "I'm going to get some handkerchiefs," Beth said. "A small bottle of perfume," said Amy. "It won't be very expensive, so I'll have money to buy myself something, too." "We will make our mother think we got something for ourselves, and then we will surprise her," said Joe. Their mother, Mrs. March, came home soon after. She took off her wet clothes and put on her warm slippers. Meg made tea. Joe brought wood for the fire. Beth was quiet and busy. Amy gave orders. "There is a letter from your father," cried Mrs. March. The girls gathered around their mother excitedly. It was a letter written to cheer them up, and at the end it contained a special message for the girls. "Give them my love and kisses. I think of them every day. I know they love me very much, and when I come back, I will be more proud of my little women than ever before." A tear fell from the tip of Joe's nose. Amy buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "I am very selfish," she cried, "but I will try to be a better girl." "We will all do so," cried Meg. "I really care about how I look, and I hate working, but I won't act like that anymore." "I'll try to be a little woman, too," said Joe. "I will not be rude and wild." Beth didn't say anything, but she started working harder on the blue glove she was knitting. So, the four sisters promised each other that they would never be grumpy, lazy, or selfish, and that they would all help each other. Over dinner that evening, they told each other of their plans. Then around 9 o'clock, Beth started playing the old piano, and they sang together. Joe always sang the wrong lyrics in the wrong place, but the girls didn't mind. After all, they had a great time together. Joe was the first to wake up on Christmas morning, and soon the others were up too. They went downstairs for breakfast. "Where is my mother?" asked Meg. "I don't know," said old Hannah. Hannah had lived with them since Meg was born and was more like a friend than a maid. "A poor woman came to the door, and your mother went out to see what she needed," she said. "She'll be back soon then," said Meg. She looked at the presents they had kept in a basket under a chair to be given to her mother when the time came. "Where's Amy's perfume bottle?" "I think she took it to wrap a gift around it," Joe said. Suddenly, they heard the door closing. "Mother is coming! Hide the basket, quick!" said Joe. But it was Amy. She came in quickly. "Where have you been and what is behind you?" asked Meg. "I ran to the store and replaced the small perfume bottle with a large one," Amy said. "I spent all my money to buy it, and I won't be selfish anymore." Meg smiled proudly and wrapped her arms around her sister. Then another sound came from the door, and the basket was pushed back under the chair. The girls rushed to the table, ready for breakfast. "Merry Christmas, Mom!" they shouted. "Merry Christmas to my little girls," replied Mrs. March. Then the smile on her face disappeared. "Girls, listen. Not far away is a poor woman named Mrs. Hummel who has a new baby. She is trying to warm her 6 children in one bed because they have no firewood. They have nothing to eat, they are hungry and cold. Would you give them your breakfast as a Christmas present?" For a minute, no one spoke. Then Joe said, "Mom, I'm so glad you're back before we started eating." And the girls quickly began to put their breakfast in the basket. "I knew you would do this," said Mrs. March, smiling. The girls and Hannah entered a cold, miserable room in an old building. In the room, they found a sick mother, a crying baby, and a group of children with white, frightened faces. The children were in bed, trying to keep warm under a blanket. The woman almost cried with happiness when she saw the girls. Bringing wood, Hannah made a fire. Mrs. March gave the mother tea and food, then dressed the little baby gently. The girls sat the children around the fire and fed them like hungry chicks. It was a very happy meal, even though the girls didn't eat any of it. In that moment, no one was happier than these hungry young ladies who were handing out their Christmas morning breakfast. When they returned home, they gave presents to their mother. Mrs. March was very surprised and delighted. They laughed and chatted a lot. For the rest of the day, the girls went about their own business. Joe loved to write plays, and the 4 girls were going to perform one of these plays that evening. They had learned their words and worked hard to make weird and wonderful outfits for all the different characters in the play. Little Women, Chapter 2. Other girls also came to watch the Christmas night play. At first, there was a lot of whispering and laughter from the 4 sisters behind the curtains. Then the curtains opened and the play began. It was an exciting story about Hugo, played by black-bearded Joe, the beautiful Zara, and the brave Roderigo. Also in the play were 2 ghosts, a cruel king, and a tall castle made of paper and wood. Unfortunately, this castle fell to the ground just as Roderigo and Zara were running away from it. There was laughter from everyone, but the players gathered themselves and continued with more danger and mystery until the happy ending was reached. All the visitors liked the play very much, and after the excitement and fun, everyone got a surprise. "Would the young ladies like to stay for dinner?" asked Hannah. And the girls could not believe their eyes when they saw the table. There was ice cream, cake, fruit, and French chocolate, and in the middle of the table there were flowers for each of the 4 players. "Where did all this come from?" asked Amy. "Maybe Santa brought it," said Beth. "It's my mother," said Meg. "Aunt March has sent it," said Joe. "You are all wrong," laughed Mrs. March. "Old Mr. Lawrence sent it." "The grandfather of the Lawrence boy?" said Meg. "But we don't know him." "Hannah told her maid about your breakfast party, and when he heard it, he was pleased," said Mrs. March. "He knew my father from years ago, and sent me a note this afternoon asking if he could send a few Christmas presents to my children." "The idea came from that boy." "I knew it," said Joe. "I'm sure he wants to get to know us, but he's very shy. Meg won't let me talk to him when we pass him on the street. She says it would be inappropriate." "You mean the people living in the big house next door, right?" one of the visiting girls asked. "My mother knows old Mr. Lawrence. She says that when he's not riding or walking with his teacher, he keeps his grandson at home and makes him work very hard. We invited the boy to our party once, but he didn't show up." "This kid needs to have some fun," Joe said. Little Women, Chapter 3. "Look," said Meg excitedly a day or 2 later. She handed Joe a piece of paper. "An invitation to the New Year's party at Sally Gardiner's house, and it's for both of us. My mother said we could go, but what should we wear?" "We wear our finest cotton dresses," said Joe. "We don't have anything else anyway. Yours is fairly new, but mine has a burn and a hole in the back." "Then you should keep the back out of sight," said Meg. "I'll have a new ribbon for my hair and new slippers. My gloves will work. Mine are stained, so I'll have to go without gloves." "You have to wear gloves when you dance, Joe," cried Meg. "Then we'll both wear one of the good ones on our hand and keep the tainted ones in the other hand," Joe said. Meg looked a little worried, but she accepted the offer. On New Year's Eve, the 2 younger sisters watched the 2 older girls get ready for the party. They were running up and down and talking all the time. Meg wanted curls in her hair, and Joe started working on the paper-wrapped ends of Meg's hair with a pair of hot tongs. "Is it normal for them to smoke like that?" asked Beth. "Wet parts dry up," said Joe. "Smells like burn," said Amy. "I'm going to get the papers out now," said Joe. "You will see a lot of little curls in your hair." When she took the papers out, the burnt hair fell out with them. "Oh! Oh! What did you do to my hair?" cried Meg. "I always do something wrong anyway," Joe said unhappily. "I am really sad. I think the tongs were too hot." "Do not worry," said Amy to Meg, who was crying. "Tie your ribbon so that the ends are a little over your forehead, and this way the burnt sections are not visible." Finally, Meg and Joe were ready, and they went to the gardener's house. Mrs. Gardiner greeted them kindly. Meg immediately started having fun with Sally. But Joe was not interested in these conversations of the girls, and was watching the dance carefully with her back to the wall. Soon after, Meg was asked to dance. Then Joe saw a red-haired boy coming towards her and hurried through a door into a small room. Unfortunately, another shy person was hiding out there, and she found herself staring at this boy named Lawrence. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know someone was here," said Joe. The boy laughed. "Do not go. I came here because I don't know anyone, but I think I've seen you before," he said. "You live close to us, don't you?" "We are neighbors," said Joe, "and we loved your beautiful Christmas present." "My grandfather sent it to you, Miss March." "But you gave your grandfather the idea, didn't you, Mr. Lawrence?" "I'm not Mr. Lawrence, just Laurie," he said. "And I'm not Miss March either, just Joe," she said. "Do you like parties?" "Sometimes," he said. "I've been abroad a lot lately, and I don't know how things are going here." "Abroad?" said Joe. "Have you been to Paris?" "We went there last winter." "Can you speak French?" Laurie said something in French, and Joe listened intently. "Who is the young lady with the beautiful slippers?" you asked. She's my sister Meg, and you already know that. Do you think she is beautiful? Yes, he said. She seems like a nice, quiet girl. This pleased Joe, and soon the two of them were talking like old friends. I've always heard that you work hard, said Joe. Are you going to college soon? Not for a year or two, he said. I'll be 16 next month, and I won't be leaving before I'm 17. I wish I could go to college, said Joe. I hate even the idea of going to college, said Laurie. Joe wanted to know why, but the boy looked so serious that instead of asking about that, "Why don't you go dance?" she asked. "I'll go if you come too," he replied. "I can't, because—" Joe paused. "Because what?" "You won't tell anyone, will you?" "Never." "I have a bad habit of standing by the fire and I burn my clothes," said Joe. "I have to stand still so that no one can see the burn on it. You are free to laugh." But Laurie didn't laugh. "It doesn't matter," he said gently. "Please, come." Joe smiled. "Okay," she said. "Thanks." When the music stopped, they sat down and started talking, but Joe saw Meg waving to her. She followed her sister into a side room. "I sprained my foot and hurt my ankle," said Meg. "I can't step on it, and I don't know how to get home either." "I'm not surprised you sprained your foot with these stupid high-heeled things," said Joe. "We'll have to get in a carriage or stay here all night." "The carriage costs a lot of money," said Meg. "We can't stay here tonight because the house is full. I'll rest until Hannah comes to pick us up, then I'll try to do my best." "They're going out to dinner now," Joe said. "I will stay with you." "No, run and get me something to eat and coffee, please," said Meg. Joe found the coffee, but spilled some on the front of her dress while bringing it. She was cleaning coffee with Meg's glove when a friendly voice spoke to her. "Can I help?" said Laurie. He held a plate of cake in one hand and coffee in the other. "I was trying to get something for Meg," Joe said. "I was looking for someone to give it to," he said. He brought Joe some more coffee and cake. Then the three of them chatted happily until Hannah arrived. Meg completely forgot about her feet and stood up. She cried out in pain, and when Laurie saw that she couldn't walk, he immediately offered to take them home in his grandfather's carriage. "But maybe you don't want to leave the party so soon," said Joe. "It's my pleasure to give you a ride home," Laurie said. Laurie sat next to the driver, and the two girls started talking excitedly about the party after they got into the back seat of the carriage with Hannah. "I had a great time. Did you?" asked Joe. "Yes, until I hurt myself," said Meg. "Sally's friend Annie Moffat asked me to stay with them for a week in the spring when Sally arrived." On the way home, Joe told Meg about her adventures. They thanked Laurie and entered the house quietly, hoping not to wake anyone. But as soon as they opened the bedroom door, two little voices shouted simultaneously, "How was the party? How was the party?" Little Women, Chapter 4. "It was so nice to go to parties and drive home," Meg said the next morning. "Some people always live this way. I wish we could live like this. I wish we were rich." "But we are not," said Joe. "Then we should go on with our lives smiling, like our mother does." Mr. March had lost most of his money in the past trying to help a friend. When the two older girls found out about this, they wanted to do something to earn some money for the family and found a job when they were old enough. Meg began tutoring 4 young children. Being poor was hard for her because she could remember times when they had everything they wanted at home. And every day she saw beautiful dresses at Mrs. King's house and heard talk of parties in the theater. These were Meg's favorite things. Joe was going to Aunt March, who needed someone to do her shopping, tidy the house, and read her a book. She was a difficult old lady who complained a lot, but Joe was trying her best. Beth was too shy to go to school with other children, so she studied at home with her father. When her father left, Beth continued to study on her own and helped Hannah with the housework. She also spent long, quiet hours talking to her dolls or playing the old piano. Beth loved music. She worked hard to make herself a better musician, even though her family couldn't afford to get her to take music lessons or buy a good piano. Amy painted beautiful pictures and dreamed of becoming a famous painter one day. She had to wear her cousin's old clothes. She had had to wear her cousin's old clothes since she was little. Her mother didn't have enough money to buy her new clothes. Although she complained about it from time to time, she was everyone's favorite in the family. One afternoon, a week later, Jo went out to clear the snow in the garden. She looked at the house next door. What Jo saw from time to time through the open curtains in its windows was a large stone house with beautiful things in it. However, it was a lonely, lifeless house where children did not play outside and many people could not enter or leave except for an old gentleman and his grandson. She hadn't seen Lawrence recently and wondered where he was. Just then, she saw him looking out the upstairs window. She threw a soft snowball against the window and she called out, "Hey! Are you sick?" Laurie opened the window. "I'm better now, thank you," he said. "I had a bad cold." "How are you spending your time?" she asked. "I cannot do anything," said Lawrence. "They won't let me." "Isn't anyone visiting you then?" "I don't know anyone." "You know us," said Jo. "Yes," laughed Laurie. "Will you come to visit me?" "I will come if my mother allows it. Let me go and ask her. Close the window and wait until I come." Laurie got excited and started preparing for Jo's visit. He combed his hair and tried to tidy his room. Soon he heard voices from below. Then a surprised maid rushed to his room. "There is a young lady who wishes to see you, sir," she said. After a while, Jo appeared with a box in one hand and Beth's 3 little cats in the other. "My mother conveyed her love," she said. "Meg asked me to take some of her cake, and Beth thought you might like to play with her cats. Funny girls, aren't they?" Laurie laughed. "How good are you all?" he said. "Shall I read you something?" asked Jo. "I prefer to talk," said Laurie. "I can talk all day," said Jo, smiling. "Beth says I never know when to shut up." Laurie smiled. "Is Beth the little girl who stays at home all day?" "Yes, that's Beth. She is a nice girl." "Meg is the pretty one, and Amy is the curly one, right?" "Yes. How did you know?" Laurie's face reddened. "I heard you calling out to each other, and you always seem to be having so much fun. Sometimes you forget to close your curtains in the evening, and I see you sitting by the fire with your mother. Well, I don't have a mother." Jo saw the sadness in his eyes. "Why don't you come and visit us one day with your grandfather?" "I would love to come, but Mrs. March should ask my grandfather first," said Laurie. Then he changed the subject. "Do you like your school?" "I do not go to school. I'm going to work, to my aunt," said Jo. She talked about her struggling and elderly aunt, and she made him laugh with her stories. She talked about her sisters, the games they played, her hopes and fears for their father. Then they talked about books, and Jo discovered that Laurie loved them just as much as she did. "Come and check out our library," he said. "My grandfather is out. You need not be afraid." "I am not afraid of anything," replied Jo. He led her to a room whose walls were lined with books and pictures. "You must be the happiest kid in the world," said Jo, sitting down in a large armchair and looking around. "Yes, but one cannot live on books alone," he said. Suddenly a bell rang. Jo jumped out of the chair. "Your grandfather," she said. "What if it is?" said Laurie, smiling. "You weren't afraid of anything, remember?" "Maybe I'm a little afraid of him," said Jo. At that moment, the maid entered. "The doctor has come to see you, sir," she said to Laurie. "Can I leave you alone for a minute or two, Jo?" he asked. "Yes, I am very happy here," said Jo. When the door opened again some time after he had left, Joe was staring at a large picture of the old gentleman with her back to the door. "I won't be afraid of him because he has kind eyes, even though he looks tough and cold," she said. "Not as handsome as my grandfather, but I liked him." "Thank you," said a deep voice behind her. She turned quickly and saw old Mr. Lawrence before her. Joe's face turned bright red, and she wanted to run away. However, the old man's eyes looked kinder than those in the picture, and there seemed to be a smile in them. "So, you're not afraid of me, huh?" he said. "Not much, sir." "But I'm not as handsome as your grandfather." "Not really, sir." "But you loved me." She laughed and shook hands with him. "Now, tell me, do you want to make friends with my grandson?" "Yes, sir. I'm trying to cheer him up," said Joe. "He seems a little lonely." "Then come and have tea with us." Laurie was very surprised and a little uneasy when he saw Joe chatting with his grandfather. However, seeing the two of them laughing, he was relieved and realized that things were not as he had feared. He cheerfully walked over to them and joined the conversation. The old man looked at the two young people and noticed the change in his grandson. "Joe is right," he thought. "I haven't seen Laurie this happy in a long time." After tea, they entered a room with a large and beautiful piano. "Do you play the piano?" Joe asked Laurie. "Sometimes," he replied. "Play a little. I'll have something to tell Beth when I get home." So Laurie played. Joe listened. Later, Mr. Lawrence said, "He plays pretty well, but I want him to excel at more important things." Joe was having a good time, but realized it was late and asked permission to go. "I hope you come back, Joe," Mr. Lawrence said, and he shook hands with her. Laurie walked with her to the door. "He doesn't really like to hear me play the piano," he said. "Why?" Joe asked. "I'll tell you one day," he said. Little Women, Chapter 5. When Joe told her family about her afternoon adventures, they all wanted to go and visit the big house. "Why doesn't Mr. Lawrence like to hear Laurie play the piano?" Joe asked her mother. "Laurie's father married an Italian lady, a musician," Mrs. March said. "The old man didn't like her and never saw his son after he got married. Laurie was born in Italy, but his parents died when he was a child, and his grandfather brought him home. Laurie loves music, and I think his grandfather is afraid he'll want to be a musician, like his mother." "Laurie should be a musician if he wants it," Joe said. "Going to a college that he doesn't want will make him unhappy." Laurie and the four girls soon became good friends. Laurie's teacher, Mr. Brooke, complained to the old gentleman that his student often went to the house next door to see the marches. "Let's let him take a little vacation," Mr. Lawrence said. "He can keep up with his lessons somehow." They all had such a great time together, writing and performing plays, happy evenings at the Marches' house, and small parties in the big house. Only Beth was too embarrassed to go there. When Mr. Lawrence heard about Beth's shyness, he said he wanted to come over for tea one day and talk to them about music and the wonderful singers he had listened to. The next afternoon, Mr. Lawrence came to visit Mrs. March and her family. The girls excitedly greeted this wealthy and kind-hearted gentleman at the door. They offered him tea and apple pie and chatted together. As Mr. Lawrence prepared to leave, "Laurie doesn't have much time for music," he said to Mrs. March. "That's why he doesn't use the piano very often. Wouldn't any of your girls want to come and play it from time to time? They don't need anyone's permission when they enter the house, and I'll be in my study anyway. But if they don't want to come," he said, and walked towards the door. At that moment, a small hand touched his own. It was Beth's hand. I would like to come," she said, her voice trembling. "You're the musician girl, aren't you?" said Mr. Lawrence gently. "My name is Beth. Yes, I love music, and I will come," she said. The next day, Beth rushed to the big house after everybody left. She searched the rooms one by one and finally found the room with the beautiful piano. As soon as she started playing, she quickly forgot her fears with the pleasure of the music. After that, Beth went there every day to play the piano. She didn't know that Mr. Lawrence would often open the study door to hear her play, or that Laurie stood in the hallway to keep the maids away from the shy little girl. Beth was so grateful that she asked her mother and sisters to help knit a pair of socks for the old gentleman. After a few days, the socks were ready. Beth wrote a short letter to Mr. Lawrence, and, with Laurie's help, she left it with the socks in the old man's study before he woke up one morning. The next day, Beth went for a walk, and when she returned, the others were waiting for her. "There's a letter for you, Beth," they called. "Come and read it now." Beth hurried into the house, and they took her into the front room. "Look over there!" they cried at the same time. Beth looked and had the biggest surprise of her life. There was a lovely little piano with a letter on it that said, "To Miss Elizabeth March." You read it, Joe," whispered Beth. "I can't read." So Joe opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Miss March, I have had many socks, but none have satisfied me as much as yours. I wanted to thank you for your kindness by sending you something that once belonged to my little granddaughter, who died. Your friend, James Lawrence." Joe hugged her sister. "Come on, play it now, Beth," she said. Beth sat down and started playing, and everyone thought it was the most perfect piano they'd ever heard. Joe knew Beth was too shy to do it, so she smiled and said, "You'll have to go and thank him." But Beth surprised them all. "I'm leaving right now," she said boldly, and walked through the garden to the big house next door. She went to the old gentleman's study and knocked on the door. "Come in," said Mr. Lawrence. Beth came in. "I came to thank you, sir," she began in her low voice. But Mr. Lawrence seemed so friendly that the little girl ran, put her arms around his neck, and kissed him. The old gentleman was so startled that he almost fell out of his chair. But he really enjoyed that shy little kiss, and soon the two of them were talking like old friends. He then walked home with Beth. The girls, who were watching with great interest from the window, could not believe their eyes. Little Women, Chapter 6. Amy saw Meg and Joe on their way somewhere one afternoon, and, "Where are you going?" she asked. "I want to come too." "No, dear, you are not invited," said Meg. "You're going somewhere with Laurie, I know." "Yes, we are," said Joe. "Now please, stop pissing us off." "You are going to the theater," said Amy suddenly. "I want to come with you too." "I guess we can take her too." Meg looked at Joe. "No, Laurie just invited us," said Joe. "I will come," cried Amy. "Meg says I can come." "Stay where you are," said Joe angrily. "You're going to regret this, Joe March," Amy cried as Meg and Joe were leaving the house. The two sisters enjoyed themselves at the theater, but Joe couldn't help worrying, wondering what Amy would do to upset her. The next afternoon she found out. Beth, Amy, and Meg were sitting together when Joe rushed into the room. "Did anyone take my notebook?" she asked. Meg and Beth said no at the same time, but Amy didn't say anything. "You got it, Amy," said Joe. "No, I don't," said Amy. "You are lying," said Joe. "Tell me the truth or I will make you regret it." "Do whatever you want," said Amy. "You will never see your stupid notebook again because I burned it." Joe's face turned white. "What? But I worked so hard to write my stories." "I said I would make you regret it, and I did," said Amy. Joe jumped on Amy and grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "You mean girl!" she cried. "I will never, ever forgive you!" And she ran out of the room. Mrs. March came home and heard what had happened. "Oh, how could you do that, Amy?" she asked. "This was Joe's notebook where she wrote her stories. She wrote it all herself, and she hoped to make them good enough to print." After a while, Amy began to cry, realizing the terrible thing she had done. Later, when Joe went down to tea, Amy begged her sister to forgive her. "I will never forgive you," replied Joe. It wasn't a happy evening, and when it was time to sing, Joe was quiet. She then kissed her mother and said, "Good night." "My dear, don't be so angry with your sister," whispered Mrs. March. "Sorry, Mom. I can't forgive her," replied Joe. The next day, Joe wanted to leave the house. She grabbed her skates and went to the house next door to ask Lori to take her skating. Amy heard they were gone. "Joe had promised to take me with her next time," she complained. "It's hard for her to forgive you, Amy," said Meg. "Go after them and wait until Joe's spirits return. Then give her a kiss or do something to please her." The river wasn't far, but Joe and Lori were already skating when Amy arrived. Joe saw Amy, but she turned the other way. Lori was gliding carefully along the edge of the ice and saw the young girl in the distance. Amy put on her skates and stood on the ice. "Stay close to the edge. The ice in the middle is not safe," Lori called out. Then he disappeared at the first bend in the river. Joe heard it, but Amy didn't. Joe realized that Amy probably hadn't heard, but said nothing and followed Lori. "Let Amy take care of herself," she thought. Amy skated across the softer ice in the middle of the river. Joe reached the bend and stood still for a moment with a strange feeling in her heart. Something made her turn around, and she saw Amy fall into freezing water through the broken ice. As Amy fell, she let out a scream that made Joe's heart stop with fear. She tried to call out to Lori, but she was speechless, and she paused for a moment, staring at the little blue hood of Amy's coat above the black water. Lori realized that something was wrong and hurried over to Joe. When he saw Amy in the water, "Oh my God! Get a piece of wood from the riverside, quick!" he cried. As Lori held Amy's head above the water, Joe, frantic with fear, brought in a large stick. Together they pulled her out of the water. Amy was unhurt, but she was trembling with both fear and cold. They immediately took her home, wrapped her in blankets, and tried to calm her down. After a while, she fell asleep in front of the warm fire. Later, when things calmed down, Joe asked her mother, "Are you sure she is okay?" "I'm sure, dear. It made the most sense for you to bring her home right away." "Lori did everything," said Joe. "Mother, if she dies, it will be my fault. I get angry very quickly. Oh, why can't I be like you?" "I get angry almost every day, too, Joe," said Mrs. March. "But I've learned not to show it. I've learned to restrain myself from speaking the angry words that come to my lips, and you can do the same, my dear." Amy fidgeted in her sleep, and Joe looked at her. "I refuse to forgive her, and she almost died today. It was Lori who saved her. How can I be so bad?" she said, and started crying. Then Amy opened her eyes and stretched out her arms with a smile that went right into Joe's heart. Neither said a word, but they hugged each other tightly, and everything was forgiven and forgotten. Little Women, Chapter 7. Annie Moffat didn't forget her promised invitation, and one April day, Meg went to stay at the Moffats' big house. Meg thought it was great. She loved to ride beautiful carriages, wear her best dress every day, and do nothing but have fun. Soon she started talking about trendy clothes and hairstyles, just like the other girls did. Meg wished she would be rich as she saw Annie's good things. Annie's older sisters, Belle and Clara, were beautiful young ladies. Mr. Moffat was a fat, friendly gentleman, and Mrs. Moffat was a kind-hearted person. They were all very kind to Meg and did their best to make her feel at home. When the evening of a small party arrived, Meg's best dress looked very old next to Sally's new dress, but no one said anything about it. The girls were getting ready when a maid brought a box of flowers. "To Miss March," she said, "and there's a letter, too." "How nice. Who does it come from?" asked the girls. "We didn't know you had a boyfriend." "The letter is from my mother. The flowers are from Laurie," said Meg. "Oh," said Annie, with a strange look. Her mother's loving words and Laurie's kindness made Meg feel much happier, and she enjoyed the party a lot. Annie got her to sing, and they agreed that Meg had a beautiful voice. Meg was having a good time until she heard someone on the other side of a large flower table ask, "How old is Mr. Lawrence's grandson?" 16 or 17, I think," said another voice. "He would make a great candidate for one of the girls," a third voice said. "Sally says they are very friendly, and the old man thinks they are all great." "I think Mrs. M. has her plan," Mrs. Moffat's voice said. "But do you think the girl knows about this?" "I think she lied about her mother. I'm pretty sure the letter actually came from the boy. Poor thing. It would be great if she had nice clothes. Do you think it would be a problem if we offered to lend her a dress for Thursday? I'll ask young Lawrence to come, and then we'll have some fun with her." Meg tried to forget what she had heard, but she couldn't. The gossip made her very angry, and she wished the party would be over soon. At that moment, all she wanted was to be alone. She wept silently to herself in her bed. Why did people have to say this? She and Laurie were just friends, but now their friendship was being damaged by unpleasant gossip. The next day, Miss Bell said, "Meg, dear, we've sent your friend Mr. Lawrence an invitation for Thursday." Meg pretended to misunderstand. "You're very kind, but I'm afraid he can't come. He is almost 70. Miss Bell laughed. "I mean the young man." "Young man," said Meg. "Laurie is only a boy." "Isn't he your age?" said Clara. He is close to Joe," said Meg. "I am going to turn 17 in August." "It is very kind of him to send you flowers," said Annie. "He sends them to all of us often," Meg said. "My mother and old Mr. Lawrence are friends, you know." "What will you wear on Thursday?" asked Sally. "My white dress again. I don't have any other dresses." "Oh, you don't have any other," said Sally. "You are very nice." "I have a beautiful blue dress, and I can't wear it any more, Meg," said Belle. "It will please me if you wear it." "You're so kind, but—" Meg began. "Please accept," said Belle. "You'll look beautiful in that dress." Meg couldn't turn down this kind offer, and on Thursday evening Belle helped turn Meg into a stylish lady. She combed and curled her hair, painted her lips, then helped her put on her sky blue dress. The collar of the dress was very low, and Meg was shocked when she saw herself in the mirror. A necklace and earrings were added, and Meg was now ready for the party. At first, she felt awkward in all these beautiful clothes, but she soon found that people who didn't usually notice her were coming to talk to her. A few young men who had only looked before now wanted to meet her. Suddenly, Meg saw Laurie across the room. He was looking at her, and he didn't look very pleased. Meg began to feel uncomfortable and wished she had worn her old dress. As she walked towards Laurie, she saw Belle and Annie both smiling and watching. "I'm glad you came," said Meg to Laurie in her most grown-up voice. "I was afraid you might not come." "Joe asked me to come over and tell her how you looked," Laurie said. "So what are you going to tell her?" "I'll say I didn't know you because you don't look like yourself," he said. "The girls dressed me for fun," said Meg. "Don't you like it?" "No, well, I don't know," he replied. Meg got angry. "Then I will not stay with you," she said, and walked to the window. A minute or two later, an old man passed by and said to his friend, "They have dressed this girl like a doll." Meg was very embarrassed at that moment. Why didn't I wear my own dress, she thought. She turned and saw Laurie behind her. "Please forgive me," he said. "Come on and eat something." Meg tried to look angry. "Please come," he said again. "I don't like your dress, but I think you're amazing." Meg smiled and saw that it was impossible to stay angry at him. "Please don't tell them about my dress at home," she said. "They don't realize it's just for fun, and that worries my mother. I was a fool to wear this dress, and I will tell them myself." "Okay, I won't say anything," Laurie promised, and he didn't see Meg again until dinner time. She was drinking wine with two boys she didn't know when he saw her. "If you drink more, you'll feel bad tomorrow, Meg," Laurie whispered to her. "I'm not Meg tonight," she said. "I'm a doll who does crazy things. Tomorrow I will be me again." Meg danced, laughed, and talked to as many young men as she could, but she went to bed feeling she wasn't enjoying herself as much as she had expected. She was sick the next day and returned home on Saturday quite tired from her 2 weeks of entertainment. "I am happy to be home," she said to her mother and to Joe. She told them that she dressed like a doll, drank too much wine, and then fell ill. She had laughed as she told them this story, but at the end her face still looked worried. Mrs. March saw Meg's blushing cheeks and said, "I think there's something else." "Yes," Meg said slowly. "I hate people who say and think horrible things about Laurie and us." Then she told them the gossip she had heard. "What nonsense," said Joe. "When I see Annie Moffat, I'll talk to her. How silly to think that my mother had plans and that we were nice to Laurie because he's rich and might marry one of us someday. When I tell Laurie, he will laugh too." "No, Joe," her mother said. "If you repeat ridiculous rumors too much, they may seem real." "Do you really have any plans, Mother?" asked Meg. "All mothers make plans, dear," said Mrs. March. "But I think my plans are different from Mrs. Moffat's. I want my girls to be loved and people to think well of them. I want them to marry good people, but I don't want them to marry rich men just because they're rich. If you're going to have a happy and peaceful life, I prefer you to be the wives of poor men. But your father and I believe we will always be proud of our daughters, married or single." "You will be proud," said Meg and Joe together. Little Women, Chapter 8. "Tomorrow is the 1st of June, and the King family is going on vacation," said Meg. "I am free for 3 months." "Aunt March went on vacation today, too," said Joe. "How wonderful life is, isn't it?" "What are you going to do on vacation?" asked Amy. "I will go to bed late at night and do nothing," said Meg. "I have a lot of books to read," said Joe. "Let's not study at all, Beth," said Amy. "Let's just play and rest just like Joe and Meg." "If Mom sees fit," Beth said. Mrs. March agreed to the plan and said they could try for a week. "But," she added, "playing all the time until Saturday night and not working can be just as bad as always working and not playing." The next day, Meg got up at 10 o'clock and had breakfast by herself. It was messy because Beth hadn't cleaned. Joe went to the river with Lori, then sat under the apple tree and read a book. Beth started tidying the cupboard, but she got tired and left it unfinished. She went to her piano, glad that she didn't have to wash the cups and plates. Amy sat in the garden to paint, hoping someone would see her and say something nice about her painting. But no one showed up, so she went for a walk, got caught in the rain, and came home very wet. After going shopping, Meg decided that she didn't like the dress she bought. Joe had a headache from reading for too long. Beth still hadn't been able to organize the cupboard, and the rain had gotten Amy's dress so wet she wouldn't be able to wear it to Katie Brown's party the next day. The weeks seemed to get longer and longer, with nothing much to do, and when Friday came, the girls were almost glad the week was over. Then Mrs. March gave Hannah a day off, and breakfast wasn't ready when the girls got up on Saturday. There was no fire in the kitchen, and they had no mother waiting for them. "What happened?" asked Joe. Meg ran upstairs. She then went downstairs and said that their mother was in her room to rest. "She says we have to fend for ourselves today," she said. They didn't show it to each other, but they were all happy to have something useful to do again. Beth and Amy placed glasses and plates on the table while Joe and Meg prepared breakfast. Then Meg brought Mrs. March tea and eggs. The tea was too strong and the egg was burnt. Mrs. March did not complain, but then laughed to herself. Joe decided to invite Lori over for dinner. "There is meat, vegetables, and lots of potatoes at home," she said to Meg. "After dinner, we eat strawberries, and then we drink coffee." Their mother said that they could do whatever they wanted, as she would eat out for dinner that day. Joe did her best, but the potatoes were hard in the middle. The vegetables had been overcooked and were falling apart, and the meat was burnt. The strawberries were not yet ripe and had salt on them instead of sugar. Unfortunately, none of these were discovered until Lori started eating them. Lori pretended everything was okay, but Amy took a spoonful and ran away from the table. "What is the problem?" asked Joe. Meg and Lori told her about her mistakes. "Oh, no," said Joe. She then saw Lori start to smile, and she started laughing too. Finally, they all laughed together. "What a terrible day," said Joe, after she cleared everything. When Mrs. March came home, she asked, "Did you enjoy your game-filled and jobless week, girls? Or would you like another week?" "I don't want that," said Joe. "I don't want it either," cried the others. "Mother, did you go out and leave us alone to see if we could take care of ourselves?" asked Meg. "Yes," said Mrs. March. "I wanted you to see that being comfortable depends on helping each other, not just thinking about ourselves. Isn't it better to devote time to both play and work and make each day useful and enjoyable?" "Oh, it is, Mother, it is," said the girls. Little Women, Chapter 9. A few days later, the four girls, Lori, his teacher, Mr. Brooke, and a few other teenagers went on a picnic together. Sally Gardiner and her English friend, Miss Kate Vaughn, were among them. It was a sunny day, and they had their picnic under the trees on a hill. After dinner, most of the young men and women played games, but Miss Kate sat under a tree and began to draw. As Meg watched her, Mr. Brooke lay on the grass beside her with a book which he didn't read. "I wish I could draw too," said Meg. "Why don't you learn?" asked Miss Kate. She was slightly older than the other girls and was a very stylish young lady. "I do not have time," said Meg. "I have a job teaching 4 children in a family." "Oh," said Miss Kate, looking rather puzzled. She didn't say anything else, but her face showed that she thought being a tutor was a little better than being a maid. Meg's cheeks immediately turned red. "In America, young women prefer to work and earn money for themselves," said Mr. Brooke quickly, "and they don't expect others to pay for everything." "I see," said Miss Kate coldly. A short time later, she took her picture and walked away. "For us, working people, there is nothing like America, Miss Meg," said Mr. Brooke, smiling. His brown eyes looked warmly at Meg, and Meg smiled at him. "I wish I loved teaching as much as you do," she said. "If you were tutoring Laurie, you would love it," Mr. Brooke said. "I will be sad when he goes to college next year, but then I will be in the army too." "I think every young man wants to be a soldier," said Meg. "But of course, it's hard for the family that's left behind." "I don't have a family, and I don't have many friends to care about whether I live or die," said Mr. Brooke sadly. "Laurie and her grandfather would care," said Meg, "and we'd all be very upset if something happened to you." "Thanks," said Mr. Brooke, immediately cheering up. Little Women, Chapter 10. One afternoon in October, Jo came into town and stopped in front of a building on one of the busy streets. She went in, looked up the stairs, and a minute later came out again. She repeated this several times. Laurie, who was crossing the road by an interesting coincidence, stopped and watched Jo and had a lot of fun. The 4th time, however, Jo shrugged and went up the stairs. The young man crossed the road and waited. 10 minutes later, Jo ran out, but she didn't seem at all happy to see him. "What are you doing here?" asked Jo. "I expect to walk home with you," Laurie said. "I have a secret to tell you, but first, you have to tell me yours." "You're not going to say anything to anyone at home, are you?" she asked. "I won't say a word," Laurie promised. "I left 2 stories which I wrote at a magazine," said Jo. "But I will have to wait until next week to know if they will be published." "Miss March, famous American writer," said Laurie, tossing his hat into the air and catching it. Jo looked pleased. "Now, what's your secret?" "Remember when Meg lost one of her gloves at the picnic?" said Laurie. "Well, I know where it is." "Is that all?" said Jo, looking disappointed. "Just wait until I tell you where it is," he said. "Tell me then," said Jo. Laurie whispered 3 words in Jo's ear. Jo looked at him, looking both surprised and dissatisfied. "How do you know?" "I saw it." "Where did you see it?" she asked. "In his pocket." "What happened? Don't you like it?" "Of course I don't. This is so stupid. What would Meg say if she knew?" "You shouldn't tell anyone," said Laurie. "I didn't promise," reminded Jo. "I thought you would like it," said Laurie. "Would I like the idea of someone taking Meg away?" said Jo. "No thanks." On the way home, Jo ran down the hill, but Laurie caught up, and they started racing. Jo's face was red, and her hair was blowing in the wind. After this pleasant run, the tension between them also came to an end. "That was so fun," said Jo. Just then, by chance, they met Meg. "What are you doing here?" she asked when she saw Jo. "You have been running, haven't you? Jo, when are you going to start acting like a young lady?" Looking sad, Jo said, "I'm not used to you changing so suddenly. Let me stay young." Meg was turning into a woman, and Laurie's secret made Jo realize that Meg would be leaving home one day, perhaps very soon. 2 weeks after Jo sneaked into town, Meg saw Laurie chasing Jo in the garden. Finally, they both rolled onto the grass, laughing. Jo had a magazine in her hand. "What are we going to do with this girl?" said Meg. "She will never act like a young lady." Moments later, Joe came in with the magazine and sat down to read. "Are you reading interesting news?" asked Meg. "No, it's just a story," said Joe. "Read it aloud," said Amy. "Maybe we might like it too." Joe began to read quickly, and the girls listened. It was a love story about two people, Viola and Angelo, and in the end, most of the characters died. The girls enjoyed it, though, and Meg even cried sometimes during the sad parts. "Who wrote it?" Beth asked, looking into Joe's face. Joe put down the newspaper. "I wrote it," she said. Her eyes sparkled. "You?" said Meg, surprised. "It's very good," said Amy. "I knew it," said Beth. She ran and hugged her sister. "Oh, Joe, I'm so proud of you." And when she was told, Mrs. March repeated the same sentence. Then they all started talking at the same time. "Tell us everything. When did you go to the magazine? How much did you get for this? How will our father react?" So Joe told them everything, and there was no family happier or more proud that evening than the Marches. Little Women, Chapter 11. Mrs. March, the girls, and Laurie were sitting together on a dull November afternoon when Hannah hurried into the room with a telegram. Mrs. March read it. Then her face turned white, and her hands trembling, she dropped the letter to the floor. Joe took the telegram and read it to the others in a frightened voice. "Mrs. March, your husband is very sick. Come immediately. S. Hale, Blank Hospital, Washington." The girls approached their mother. All their happiness was gone in an instant. "I have to go now," said Mrs. March. "I hope it is not too late. Oh, my children!" For a few moments there was only the sound of crying. Then Hannah hurried away to pack the things needed for the journey. "Where is Laurie?" asked Mrs. March. "I am here," said the boy. "I can do whatever you want." "Can you send a telegram and say I'll come right away?" Mrs. March said. "The next train leaves early in the morning. Now I must write a note to Aunt March. Joe, will you give me pen and paper?" Joe knew that the money for the trip had to be borrowed from Aunt March, and she wanted to do something to help her father. Laurie went out to take the note to Aunt March and send the telegram. Joe went to buy things from the shops, and Amy and Meg helped their mother get ready. "Your father will need good food and wine to recover. We can't find them in the hospital," Mrs. March said. "Beth, go and ask Mr. Lawrence for a couple of bottles of wine." Beth came back with Mr. Lawrence. He offered to go with Mrs. March, but she wouldn't let the old gentleman make this long, tiring journey. As much as she wanted to have someone by her side, she couldn't ask that of him. Mr. Lawrence said, "I'll be back in a minute," and he walked away. Soon after, Meg spotted Mr. Brooke by the door. "I am sorry to hear the news, Mrs. March," he said gently. "Mr. Lawrence and I think it would be a good idea for me to travel with you." "How kind of you all," said Meg. "It will be so nice to know that there is someone to accompany my mother. Thanks a lot." She held out her hand and smiled gratefully into his warm brown eyes. Laurie soon returned with a letter and some money from Aunt March, but Joe was not yet around. It was afternoon when she finally got into the house and handed her mother some money. "This is going to make my father comfortable and bring him home," she said. $25, said Mrs. March. "My dear, where did you find this?" Joe took off her hat. "Your hair! Your beautiful hair!" cried Amy. All of Joe's lovely, thick, long hair was cut short. "Joe, how could you do that?" cried Meg. "My dear girl, that was not necessary," Mrs. March said. "She doesn't look like my Joe, but I love her for doing it," said Beth and started to cry. "Don't cry, Beth," said Joe. "I wanted to do something for my father, and all I could think of doing was to sell my hair. Soon I will have curly hair again." But later, while Amy and Beth were asleep, Meg heard Joe crying. Meg and Joe went back to work in the days after their mother left with Mr. Brooke. Beth and Amy helped Hannah with the housework. All of them tried to be very hard-working and helpful. A few days later, news came from their father. It said that he was dangerously ill at first, but then slowly getting better. 10 days after their mother had left, Beth returned from the Hummels' house and went straight to her mother's room and locked herself inside. She was looking after a sick baby in that house. Half an hour later, Joe found her sitting there, looking very sick. "Beth, what's wrong?" cried Joe. Beth warned her not to approach her and said, "You had scarlet fever, didn't you?" "Yes, we had it together with Meg years ago," said Joe. "Why are you asking?" "Oh, Joe, Mrs. Hummel's baby is dead," said Beth. "It died in my arms before Mrs. Hummel came home." "Oh, poor Beth. It must have been so hard for you," said Joe, wrapping her arms around her sister. "So what did you do?" "I sat and held it in my arms until Mrs. Hummel arrived with the doctor. Heinrich and Minna were also feeling sick, and the doctor looked at them and said, 'Scarlet fever.' Then he told me to go home right away and get some medicine or I would catch it too." "I'll get Hannah right away," said Joe and went out. "Don't let Amy come," said Beth. "She hasn't had it. I don't want to give it to her." It was decided that Amy should go to Aunt March's house, and Laurie took her there. Poor Amy didn't like the plan at all, and only agreed to go when Laurie said he would visit Beth every day to bring her news. When Laurie returned, he asked Joe and Meg if he should send a telegram to Mrs. March. "Hannah says my mother can't leave my father alone, and that will only worry her," said Meg. "She says Beth won't be sick for long, and she knows what needs to be done, but that still doesn't seem right." Mr. Lawrence was not allowed to see Beth, and Meg felt unhappy as she wrote letters to her mother that said nothing about Beth's illness. Joe looked after Beth day and night, but at some point, Beth began not to recognize her and called her mother. Joe was frightened, and Meg wanted to write to her mother what had happened, but Hannah said there was no danger yet. Then they received a letter saying that Mr. March's condition was worse, and that he would not be able to return home for a long time. Little Women, Chapter 12. How dark the days seemed, how sad and lonely. As the shadow of death fell on the once happy house, the sisters struggled and waited with all their might. During that difficult time, Meg realized that true wealth is love, peace, and health. Watching her younger sister, Jo thought about how helpful Beth had always been. It was as if she was living for others and trying to make home a happy place for everyone who came there. Sad and lonely at Aunt March's house, Amy also wanted to do something to help Beth. On the first day of December, early in the morning, the doctor came. He looked at Beth, then said quietly, "If Mrs. March can leave her husband, I think she should come home." Jo donned her coat and ran across the snow to send a telegram. When she returned, Laurie had brought a letter saying that Mr. March had recovered. That was good news, but Jo's face was so unhappy. "What happened?" Laurie asked. "Is Beth worse off?" "I called my mother," said Jo, starting to cry. "Beth doesn't know us anymore." Laurie took her hand and whispered, "Here I am, Jo. Your mother will be here soon, and then everything will be fine." "I'm glad my father is getting better," Jo said. "My mother wouldn't feel bad leaving him alone and coming here." "You are so tired," said Laurie, "but I will tell you something that will cheer you up more than anything." "What?" she asked. Laurie smiled. "Yesterday I sent your mother a telegram, and Mr. Brooks said she would be right back. So she will be here tonight, and everything will be all right." Jo wrapped her arms around him. This time she didn't cry, and hugged her friend tightly. Laurie was surprised, too. Then he smoothed her hair, followed by a few small kisses. Jo gently pushed him away. Laurie laughed, then continued. My grandfather and I thought your mother should know. She wouldn't forgive us if anything happened to Beth. Her train will arrive at 2 in the morning, and I will meet her." It snowed all day, and the hours passed slowly. The doctor came and said that after midnight he expected a change in Beth's condition, for better or worse, and would be back around that time. Hannah fell asleep in a chair next to Beth's bed. Mr. Lawrence waited downstairs, while Laurie lay down on the sofa pretending to rest. The girls just waited, could not sleep. At 12 o'clock there seemed to be a change in Beth's face. Hannah continued to sleep, but the girls saw the shadow cast on the small bed. An hour passed, and Laurie quietly left for the station. At 2 o'clock, Jo was standing at the window watching the snow. She heard a noise, and when she turned, she saw Meg kneeling beside her mother's chair. A cold fear gripped Jo. "Beth is dead," she thought. She ran to the bed to say goodbye to her. The pain on Beth's face had passed, and now there was a peaceful smile in its place. Jo kissed her and whispered softly, "Goodbye, Beth, goodbye." Jo had just collapsed on the bed, clutching Beth's hand. At that moment, Hannah woke up and looked at Beth. "Her fever is gone," she cried. "She is sleeping and breathing easily." Jo looked at Hannah in disbelief. The doctor came soon. "I think she will get better," he said. "Be quiet and let her sleep." Meg and Jo hugged each other tightly, their hearts filled with happiness beyond words. Beth lay as before, her cheek in her hand, and breathing silently. "I wish my mother would come now," whispered Jo. And after a while, they heard the sound of the door below. A cry from Hannah, followed by Laurie's happy voice, "Girls, she's here! Your mother is here!" When Beth woke up from her long sleep, she looked at her mother's face and smiled. Then she slept again. Mrs. March took her daughter's thin hand. While Hannah was preparing something to eat, their mother told the girls about their father's health and Mr. Brooks' promise to stay with him. Then Meg and Jo closed their tired eyes and finally fell asleep. Laurie went to Aunt March's house to tell Amy the good news. He, too, was tired after the long night, and he managed to tell his story before he fell asleep in the chair. Amy started to write a short letter to her mother, but before she could finish, she saw her mother coming home. She ran out to meet her. There were probably lots of happy little girls in town that day, but Amy was the happiest when she sat on her mother's knee. "I thought a lot about you, Beth," she said. "Everyone loves her because she is unselfish. If I was sick, people wouldn't feel so bad about me, but I would love to be loved and missed. I will try to be like Beth as much as I can." Her mother kissed her. "I am sure you will be successful," she said. "Now I have to get back to Beth. Be patient, little girl. We'll get you home again soon." Little Women, Chapter 13. That evening, while Meg was writing to her father, Jo went upstairs to Beth's room. While the little girl was sleeping, she found her mother sitting by the bed. "I want to tell you something, Mom," she said. "Is it about Meg?" asked Mrs. March. "How quickly did you guess?" said Jo. "Yes, it's about her. Meg lost one of her gloves at a picnic last summer, and Laurie told me that Mr. Brooke had the glove and kept it in his jacket pocket. He dropped it once, and Laurie saw it. Mr. Brooke told Laurie that he loved Meg. But because Meg is so young and he's so poor, he hesitated to tell her. Isn't it all awful?" "Do you think Meg likes and cares for him?" asked Mrs. March with a worried look. "I don't know anything about love," said Jo. "You think she is not interested in John?" asked Mrs. March. "Who?" said Jo, looking up. "Mr. Brooke," her mother said. "I call him John because we became good friends at the hospital. "Look at him," said Joe. "He was nice to my father, and now you'll let Meg marry him if she wants to." "My dear, don't be angry," said Mrs. March. "John has honestly told us that he loves Meg, but before he asks her to marry him, he says he'll make enough money to have a comfortable home. He really wants Meg to love him too. He is an excellent young man, but your father and I will not consent to Meg marrying before she turns 20. "I want her to marry Laurie and be rich," said Joe. "I'm afraid Laurie isn't old enough for Meg," said Mrs. March. "Don't plan, Joe. Let time and their own hearts bring them together." Later, Meg entered with a letter to her father. "Beautifully written, my dear," said her mother, looking at the letter. "Please add that I am sending my love to John." "You call him John?" said Meg, smiling. "Yes, he is like our son, and we are very fond of him," said Mrs. March, watching her daughter closely. "I am glad about that because he's so lonely," was Meg's response. "Good night, Mother." Mrs. March kissed her gently. She doesn't love John yet, she thought, but she will soon find out. Little Women, Chapter 14. Laurie quickly realized that Joe was keeping a secret that she refused to tell him, but he guessed that the secret was about Meg and Mr. Brooke, and he was angry that his teacher didn't say anything. He started making some special plans of his own. Meanwhile, Meg was busy preparing something for her father's return, but a change suddenly seemed to come over her. For a day or two she would jump when spoken to, and a worried expression appeared on her face. Then she got a letter, and a few minutes later, Mrs. March and Joe saw Meg staring at the letter with a frightened expression. "What happened, my child?" asked Mrs. March. "This must be a mistake. He couldn't have sent it." "Joe, how could you do that?" she said, and took her face in her hands and wept. "Me? I did not do anything," said Joe. "What are you talking about?" Meg tossed the letter to Joe. "You wrote it, and that bad boy helped you. How can you be so cruel, and cruel to both of us?" Joe and her mother read the letter Meg had thrown. "Dear Meg, I can no longer hide my love for you, and need to know your answer before I return. I can't tell your parents yet, but if they know we love each other, I think they'll agree. Mr. Lawrence will help me find a good job, and then you and I will be happy. Don't say anything to your family yet, but send me a word of hope through Laurie. Your dear John." "Look at that boy," said Joe. "I will make him regret it." But her mother said, "Wait, Joe, are you sure this has nothing to do with you?" "I have never seen this letter before," said Joe, "but Mr. Brooke doesn't write such stupid things." Looking at the second letter in her hand, Meg said unhappily, "It looks like his writing." "Didn't you answer the letter, Meg?" asked Mrs. March. "Yes, I answered," cried Meg, hiding her face again. "If I ever get my hands on that kid!" cried Joe. Mrs. March sat next to Meg and said, "Tell me everything now." "Laurie brought the first letter," said Meg. "He didn't seem to know anything about it. I was going to tell you, but I remembered how much you liked Mr. Brooke, and I thought it would be appropriate to keep my little secret for a while. I can't look at your face any more." "What did you write to him?" asked Mrs. March. "I just said I was too young to do anything and didn't want to keep a secret from you, so he had to talk to my father. I thanked him for his kindness and said I would be his friend for a long time, nothing more." Mrs. March smiled and looked pleased. Joe laughed. "What did he answer to that?" He writes here that he never sent any love letters and says he's so sorry my sister Jo is playing games with us, Meg said. I don't think Brooks saw any of those letters, Jo said. I think Laurie wrote both, and he's keeping yours because I won't tell him my secret. Go and fetch Laurie, Jo, Mrs. March said. I will put an end to all this immediately. After Jo had gone out, Mrs. March kindly told Meg of Mr. Brooks' true feelings. Now, dear, do you love him enough to wait until he can make a home for you? I am afraid and worried, replied Meg. I want to stay as far away from love matters as possible, maybe even for the rest of my life. If John doesn't know all this, don't tell him, and please make sure Jo and Laurie stay quiet too. Mrs. March tried to calm her daughter down, but as soon as Meg heard that Laurie had returned with Jo, she fled the room, and Mrs. March saw the boy alone. Laurie guessed why when she saw Mrs. March's angry face. Jo waited outside the room. Inside, voices rose and fell for half an hour. But the girls never understood what was being said. When they were called in, Laurie apologized to Meg and told her that Mr. Brooke knew nothing about the letters. Please forgive me, Meg, he said. I'll try, said Meg, but I didn't think you could be this cruel. Laurie looked so upset that Jo wanted to forgive him immediately, but refused to say anything and even look at him. I wish I had been more forgiving, she thought, when she saw him leave the house, hurt and unhappy. But she could never stay angry for long, and after a while, using one of Mr. Lawrence's borrowed books as an excuse, she hurried to the big house. Is Mr. Lawrence in? She asked a maid. Yes, miss, but you can't see him, said the maid. Why? Is he sick? No, but he's arguing with Mr. Laurie. And where is Laurie? He's locked in his room and won't come out. I'll go and see what's wrong. I'm not afraid of either of them. She went upstairs and knocked on Laurie's door. I want to be alone, cried Laurie. Jo immediately knocked on the door again, and the door opened. Before Laurie could stop her, she entered. I came to tell you that I forgive you, she said. Really? Said Laurie. Thanks. What is the problem? Jo asked, seeing his unhappy face. I couldn't tell my grandfather why your mother wanted to see me because I promised her not to tell anyone, he said. But then my grandfather beat me up and tried to find out the truth, so I came here and locked myself in my room. I hope he regrets doing this, Jo said. Now go downstairs and tell him you're sorry. I will help you. No, I'm not going down, said Laurie angrily. I felt sorry for Meg and asked her to forgive me, but I wouldn't apologize if I wasn't at fault. If I don't want to say anything to him, he should understand me. I don't like being beaten up like this, and I'm not going down until he apologizes. Listen, if I convince your grandfather to apologize, will you come down? Said Jo. Yes, but you cannot persuade him, replied Laurie. If I can persuade the young one, I can persuade the old one, Jo thought as she went down. Come in, said Mr. Lawrence when she knocked on his door. It's me, sir, said Jo. I was going to return a book. Would you like to borrow a new one? Asked the old man. He looked angry, but tried not to show it. Yes, please, said Jo. She pretended to look for another book as Mr. Lawrence glared at her. What is that boy doing up there? He asked suddenly. He won't tell me. He did something wrong, and we forgave him, said Jo. But we all promised not to say a word to anyone. He should not hide behind a promise he made to you, soft-hearted girls, the old gentleman said. Tell me, Jo. I can't, sir, because my mother ordered me not to, said Jo. And if I told you, someone else would be in trouble, not Laurie. This seemed to calm the old man. "Then I will forgive him," he said, after a while. He's a tough kid and hard to handle, you know." "So am I," said Joe, "but a few kind words always work." "You think I'm not being nice to him?" he said sternly. "You're usually very kind," said Joe, somewhat frightened. "But sometimes you get angry." The old gentleman looked a little embarrassed. "You're right, although I love the child, sometimes I have a hard time being patient with him. Bring him down and tell him everything is fine. I'm sorry I beat him up." "Why don't you write him an apology note, sir?" said Joe. "He says he won't come down until an apology comes in." Mr. Lawrence gave her another stern look, but then smiled and put on his glasses. "Give me a paper from there and I'll see," he said. The words were written, and Joe kissed the old man's cheek. Then she went upstairs and threw the letter under Laurie's door. But before she left, Laurie was out. "Congratulations, Joe," he said. "Did he shout at you?" "No, he was pretty calm," said Joe. "Now go and eat your food. You'll both get along better from now on." Everyone thought it was over, but Meg remembered, even if the others had forgotten. She never mentioned Laurie's teacher, but she often thought of him and dreamed about him. Once, while searching for something on her sister's desk, Joe found a piece of paper that repeatedly said, "Mrs. Brooke." Little Women, Chapter 15. Christmas Day was very different that year. Beth was feeling much better and went to the window to see the snowman Joe and Laurie had made. The snowman held a basket of fruit and flowers in one hand and a new sheet of music in the other. Laurie was running up and down, bringing presents, and Joe was singing a funny song. "I am so happy," she thought. "I wish my father were here, too." Half an hour later, Laurie came home and quietly opened the door. "Another Christmas present for the March family," he called out. He walked away, and in his place, another tall man appeared, holding the arm of a tall man. "Father!" cried Meg and Joe together. Mr. March disappeared under lots of loving arms and kisses. While trying to explain the situation, Mr. Brooke accidentally kissed Meg. Suddenly the door to the other room opened and Beth rushed straight into her father's arms. There were tears of happiness on many faces before all the excitement subsided. Then Mrs. March thanked Mr. Brooke for taking care of her husband, and he and Laurie left the family alone. Mr. March and Beth sat in a large armchair, and the others sat around them. "I wanted to surprise you all, and the doctor let Mr. Brooke bring me home," Mr. March said. "John has been very good to me. He is an excellent young man." Mr. March looked at Meg, who was staring at the fire, then smiled at his wife. She answered him with a smile. Joe understood perfectly well what those smiles meant, and she went to the kitchen and muttered to herself about perfect young men with brown eyes. They had never had a Christmas dinner like that day. Mr. Lawrence, his grandson, and Mr. Brooke were also with them. Throughout the meal, Joe gave the teacher a series of glares and did not speak to him, which amused Laurie. The guests left early, and the happy family sat by the fire. "We thought Christmas was going to be bad, remember?" asked Joe. "It's been a pretty good year," said Meg, thinking of Mr. Brooke. "I think it has been difficult," said Amy. "I'm glad it's over because we got Dad back," whispered Beth, sitting on her father's knee. "I discovered a few things about you, young ladies, today," said Mr. March. "What are they?" cried Meg excitedly. "Here is one," he said, taking Meg's hand. She had a small burn on the back and 2 or 3 calluses on the front. "I remember when this hand was white and smooth. It was beautiful then, but for me it is much more beautiful now. I'm proud of this hard-working hand, Meg." "What about Jo?" whispered Beth. "She tried so hard and took very, very good care of me." He smiled and looked at Jo sitting across from him. "Her hair may be short, but now I see a young lady in front of me. Maybe I'll miss my wild girl, but I'm sure I'll love the warm-hearted woman who took her place." Jo's face was red in the firelight as she listened. "Now, Beth," said Amy. "She is not as shy as she used to be," her father said fondly, and hugged Beth, remembering how close they had come to losing her. Then he looked at Amy, who was sitting on the floor. "Today I noticed Amy helping everyone with patience and a smile. She's learned to think more about others and less about herself." Beth left her father's arms and went to the piano. She touched the keys lightly and she began to sing. Soon, others joined her in a Merry Christmas carol. Little Women, Chapter 16. Jo and Meg were sitting at the window when they saw Laurie the next afternoon. When Laurie saw Meg, he got down on one knee in the snow, slapped his chest with one hand, and extended his arms towards her. When Meg motioned for him to leave, he pretended to cry. Meg laughed. "What is he doing?" she asked. "He was showing you how your John would act," said Jo curtly. "Don't say my John. That's not true." But Meg silently said those words over and over in her head. "If he asks you to marry him, it's more effective if you cry or look stupid instead of saying no out loud," Jo said. "No, I won't do that," said Meg. "I will say, 'Thank you, Mr. Brooke, you are very kind, but I am too young to marry you. Please, let's be friends like before.'" "I don't believe it," said Jo. "You have to believe. Then I will leave the room with my head held high." Meg stood up and acted like she was doing this, but then she rushed back to her seat when she heard someone knock on the door. Jo opened the door with an angry look. "Good day," said Mr. Brooke. "I came to get my umbrella that I forgot here yesterday." "I will bring it," said Jo, pushing him inside. Now that they're alone, Meg can say those words to him, she thought. But Meg was on her way to the door. "My mother will want to see you," she said. "I'll call her." "Don't go," he said. "Are you afraid of me, Meg?" "How can I be afraid when you treat my father so well?" said Meg. "I wish I could thank you for that." "You can," he said. And he took Meg's little hand in his and looked at her lovingly. "Oh, please don't," she said. She looked scared. "I just want to know if you love me a little, Meg," he said gently. "I love you." It was time to repeat the words she had said to Jo, but Meg forgot it all in that moment. "I don't know," she said, in such a soft voice that John had to come a little closer to hear her answer. He smiled gratefully. "Are you going to try to find out?" "I am too young," she said hesitantly, but her heart was beating very fast. "I'll wait until you learn to like me," he said. "Is this too hard for you?" "Not if I choose to learn," she said. "Please choose, Meg. I love to teach, and it is easier than teaching German," said John, taking her other hand. She looked at him and saw that he was smiling. He looked so confident of his success that Meg became a little annoyed. She felt excited and awkward and said, "I wouldn't choose," taking her hands from his. "Please go." Poor Mr. Brooke looked shocked. "Do you really want me to go?" "Yes," she said, quite enjoying the game she was playing. "I don't want to think about it. It's too early." "I'll wait," he said. He looked so unhappy that Meg started to feel sorry for him. At that moment, Aunt March entered. She had come to see Mr. March and hoped to surprise the family. She managed to surprise Meg and John quite well. Meg, face red, stared at her aunt. Mr. Brooke hurried into another room. "Oh, my God! What is all this?" cried Aunt March. "My father's friend," said Meg hastily. "I'm very surprised to see you, Aunt March." "I can see that," she said, sitting down. "What did he say to make you blush?" "Mr. Brooke and I were just talking," said Meg. "Brooke, the child's teacher? I understand now. I know everything because I got Joe to say it. You didn't agree to marry him, did you, Meg? If you did, you won't be able to get a dime of my money. You hear?" What was said was absolutely wrong. When Meg was ordered not to marry John Brooke, Meg immediately decided to marry him. "I can marry whomever I want, Aunt March, and you can give your money to whomever you want," she said. "You will regret it," said Aunt March. "Why don't you marry a rich man who can help your family?" "My father and mother like John, even though he is poor." "Be reasonable, Meg," said her aunt. "He knows I have money, and that's why he likes you." "Don't say that," said Meg. "My John won't marry for money. We'll work and wait, and I'll be happy with him because he loves me." Meg stopped when she remembered that she had just told her John to go. Aunt March was very angry. "Don't expect anything from me," she said, and she left the room, slamming the door behind her. Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Before she could decide, Mr. Brooke came back from the next room and put his arms around her. "Oh, Meg, I heard your conversation," he said. "Thank you for proving that you love me, just a little bit." "I wasn't even aware of my feelings until I said those things about you," said Meg. "So, can we be happy?" he said. "Yes, John," she whispered, and rested her head on John's chest. Joe came back and found them just like that. Meg jumped and turned around, but John Brooke laughed and kissed the shocked Joe, saying, "My sister Joe, wish us luck!" Joe rushed upstairs to find her parents. "Come down quickly," she said. "John Brooke is behaving terribly, and Meg likes it." Mr. and Mrs. March hurried out of the room as Joe threw herself on the bed and told Beth and Amy the terrible news. But the little girls thought it was very interesting and enjoyable. Little Women, Chapter 17. No one knew what was said that afternoon, but what was needed was spoken. After convincing them that their plan was good and logical, Mr. Brooke proudly invited Meg to dinner. Everyone looked so happy that Joe tried to look happy too. After dinner, Laurie brought some flowers with the words, "To Mrs. Brooke," on them. Then Laurie followed Joe to the corner of the room as the others went out to greet old Mr. Lawrence. "What's the matter, Joe?" Laurie asked. "You don't look happy." "Nothing will be the same," said Joe sadly. "I lost my dearest friend." "You won me over," said Laurie. "I'm not very good at these things, but I promise to always be your friend, Joe." "I know you will be," said Joe gratefully. "So don't worry," he said. "I'll be back from college in 3 years, and then we'll go abroad or take a nice trip somewhere. Don't you like this?" "Anything can happen in 3 years," Joe said. "This is true," said Laurie. "Time will tell for all of us what will happen." Joe agreed, and her face lit up as she looked at the view in the room. Her father and mother were sitting happily together. Amy was painting Meg and John, who were looking lovingly at each other. Beth was sitting by the fireplace, chatting with her old friend, Mr. Lawrence. They were all healthy, happy, and peaceful, and that was what mattered. The end.